Hello everybody, welcome back to Age Doctor Who. This video's been a long time coming, but we're now going to do the top 5 stories for the 6th Doctor. Possibly the most criminally underrated Doctor of them all. But anyway, so it has been a couple of months or so since I did a video in this series, so quick refresher. I'm picking out my 5 favourite stories for each Doctor in each video, and we've got honourable mentions at the end as well for stories that I really like but didn't quite make the top 5. This list is open to stories from any medium of the Doctor Who universe, so it can be TV episodes, novels, audios, anything at all that I like, but I am of course limiting it to stories that I have myself experienced. So, number 1, I'm putting Vengeance on Varos. This is definitely one of the big standout 6th Doctor stories in the TV show, at least, and I think most people will probably agree with me on that, based on what I've read online about people's opinions. This is just a delightfully grim story. Even without the violence and sort of dark aspect of it, I think it's a really good script from start to finish, pretty much. Part of my love for this story might be from nostalgia, because it was the first ever 6th Doctor story I ever watched. It was the first one that I got on DVD and watched. It was also one of the very earliest classic stories I ever got on DVD, actually. So yeah, it is actually one of my, some of my oldest memories of Doctor Who are actually of this story, I think. But yeah, nostalgia aside, this is a brilliant story. Syl is a great villain. I wish they'd bring him back someday, or like at least his species. I feel like the Mentors could be quite an interesting villain in a modern setting. I think the 6th Doctor's really finding his character by this point as well. This is only his 3rd story, but I think he's really starting to nail what this character is supposed to be. And yeah, all around is great. Great atmosphere and setting, great villains, the whole, plot's really good. The special effects are pretty damn outstanding, actually. So yeah, brilliant story. Number 2, though, is going to be The Two Doctors. I absolutely love The Two Doctors. I think it's a very unique story. It's a multi-Doctor story that isn't being made as any kind of celebration or anniversary special. It's just a random multi-Doctor story in the middle of a random season of Classic Who, and it's brilliant. Although it does take a long time for the two Doctors to actually meet up face to face in this story, but it's well worth it in the end, I think. I quite like the Androgums as a villain. They're not hugely original, shall we say, but I think they do some good stuff with them. Shockeye is both an incredibly ridiculous villain and also a very menacing one. Also kind of funny at times. I think that's a good combination that not many villains are able to pull off. The Sontarans, I think, are pretty good in this, even if they maybe are a little sidelined. I don't know. 6 to Perry and Jamie are like one of the best TARDIS teams that we never had. I kind of wish those 4 would sort of stay together for a bit longer after this. I know that wouldn't have worked, timelines and all that, but that would have been quite interesting if we just had like a mini-series of the 2nd Doctor and Jamie and the 6th Doctor and Perry going on adventures. I would have quite liked that. I absolutely adore the location filming that they did in Spain, so, the location filming in this is brilliant. And the sets they use as well, while a bit wacky and 80s sci-fi, I think are really good too. Next up, number 3, I'm going to do Revelation of the Daleks. Another classic 80s story. The 6th Doctor's only on-screen encounter with the Daleks, and I've actually grown to love it a lot more than what I did originally. When it comes to the 80s Dalek stories, I feel like, especially with Resurrection and Revelation, I never used to like them all that much, but I've definitely grown to like them more as I've gotten older. Remembrance of the Daleks I loved right from the beginning, and I still love them to this day, but the other 2 took a bit of time to get into, I think it's because they're a bit more slower paced, slightly less wacky, and not quite as action-packed as Remembrance of the Daleks. They take a bit more nuance to get into, I think, but once you get into them, you get into them. But yeah, Revelation of the Daleks is brilliant. It introduces my favourite Dalek design, which is the Imperial Daleks, who would feature a lot more prominently a couple of years later alongside the 7th Doctor. Davros is menacing as fuck in this, and it's brilliant, and the whole Soylent Green-esque subplot with Davros converting the dead, or the perpetually interred, shall we say, people from this galactic funeral home into food for other human colonies is really fucking grim when you think about it, and I'm kind of surprised they got away with it. I'm surprised they got away with most of the stuff in this story, actually. This is a really grim episode. But yeah, I highly recommend going and giving it a watch if you haven't seen it already. It's possibly the 6th Doctor's era at its best, or definitely one of its highest points. Number 4, I'm going to put the entirety of Season 23 up next with Trial of a Time Lord. Personally, I count this as one long-running story, although you can count it as 4 individual ones, but, considering the title sequence for each episode says The Trial of a Time Lord, and it goes parts 1 to 14 rather than individual titles. I like to count it as one full story that just so happens to be 4 separate acts, shall we say. There's quite a bit to get through with Trial of a Time Lord, given how it's 14 episodes long, but long story short, I bloody love it. That said, I have noticed a fair few flaws with it from a story perspective over the years and a few rewatches, so I may not hold it in the highest regard that I did a few years ago, but I still think it's brilliant. There is a bit of nostalgia that plays into my love for season 23 again, as it was one of the earlier classic Who experiences that I had. So I've kind of grown up on season 23. Yeah, it's kind of hard to shake that nostalgia off, you know? By this point, they've absolutely nailed the Sixth Doctor. This is basically the Sixth Doctor that we see in the audios, where he's well refined, much better than what he was initially introduced as at the beginning of his era. The Mysterious Planet section, I think, holds up really well. I love the whole plot of that and how it sets a few questions up. Mind Warp is just deliciously dark and grim, and I love it. It's kind of a sequel of sorts to Vengeance on Varos. It has Syl returning as a villain, and it has more of his species also playing a villain role, which is great. It's like Vengeance on Varos turned up to 11, and you thought Vengeance on Varos was grim. Mind Warp will leave you heartbroken and traumatized. Do we even need to mention the fact this has Brian Blessed as a guest star? Terror of the Vervoids is possibly the weakest segment in Trial of a Time Lord, but it's still quite enjoyable. And then the Ultimate Foe it can be kind of mixed, but I think ultimately it's a pretty decently satisfying ending, although maybe a little anticlimactic for what you might expect when it's essentially the Doctor versus Evil Doctor. But yeah, overall there's a lot to like in Trial of a Time Lord. Is it flawed? Quite a bit. Is it terrible? I wouldn't say so, no. And number 5 on my list, it's the first non-TV based entry, and I'm going with the audio drama Jubilee. Now, a quick disclaimer, outside of the Sixth Doctor's TV appearances, I've really not delved into his expanded media very much. I've read like 1 novel and heard maybe 2 audios from him. I didn't have a lot to choose from when I made the list, but I think Jubilee definitely deserves to be up there. Rob Shearman really should have written more for Doctor Who. Rob Shearman should have been the goddamn script editor at some point in Doctor Who's history. I don't care. It's not too late. Russell, I know you've probably got a script editor there already, but if you ever need a new script editor, hire Rob Shearman, I beg of you. The man's a genius. And yeah, this is kind of a prototype of sorts for the 9th Doctor episode Dalek. It was written a couple years before the modern era was created. It is actually like a prototype to Dalek, because they were both written by Rob Shearman, and I think the story actually is that the BBC asked Rob Shearman to basically adapt this audio into what became Dalek, and listening to Jubilee and watching Dalek, especially back to back, you really do notice a lot of the similarities to it. Besides the different Doctor and the different setting and, well, the entire different plot really. It essentially is the same basic premise of the Daleks manipulating a human into helping them get into a position of power, but then as time goes on, the Dalek or Daleks, something weird happens to them and they end up becoming more human, like we see in Dalek, and that ends up leading to their own downfall by the end of the story. They both follow the same basic premise in that regard, but otherwise the plots are quite different. But yeah, Jubilee is just fantastic. Some pretty grim moments in there as well. I've really got to give it a re-listen, actually. I haven't heard it in a couple of years, but I'd highly recommend it. If you haven't heard it, go check it out. You can get it for literally £3 off Big Finish. I mean, if that isn't worth your time and money, I don't know what is. And I've only got one honourable mention for the Sixth Doctor's video today. Like I said, I've not heard or read or watched that many Sixth Doctor's stories, so I'm quite limited on what I can pick. But for the honourable mentions, I'm going to put the novel Players. I read that from the 50th anniversary book range that they did. It's a republish of an older book, and for the Sixth Doctor they did the book Players. It's basically a story about the Sixth Doctor and Perry essentially travelling through history, checking up on Winston Churchill at different points in his life, because they realise that some aliens of some description, or these like weird eternal-like creatures, shall we say, they're basically just naughty gods that like to mess with history, essentially. They're trying to manipulate Churchill's timeline, so yeah, it's basically trying to make sure Winston Churchill and his life go according to plan, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's a pretty good little book. To be honest, I don't know if I'd really call it all that standout, but I did thoroughly enjoy it, and like I said, I didn't have much to put in the honourable mentions section, so I thought, if I'm going to put anything, I'll put Players, because I thought it was a pretty solid story. Anyway, if you couldn't tell, I'm kind of running out of steam here in my whole thought box, so I think this is a good point to end the video. So that was my top 5 Sixth Doctor stories, plus honourable mentions. Comment what some of your favourite Sixth Doctor stories are down below. It can be anything, TV stories, novels, audios, comics, anything at all. Leave a like if you enjoy, subscribe if you haven't already. Be back in about a week or so with another video, and until then, see you all. Bye bye. Carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice.